So I really want to talk more about Shiism in the 21st century, mainly after what we're seeing with Iran after October 7th, 2023. But I don't want to focus only on this time period because we've seen a lot of differences and a lot of new dynamics before 2023. 2023 was just like an acceleration of Iranian dynamics with the government that is weakening, but also we've seen how Iraq is also facing elections now. And so, as we've known since the fall of Saddam Hussein regime, Iran has taken a lot of influence in Iraq political sphere, and Shiism is also one of the main religion in the country. We've seen also Hezbollah being kind of like weakened, but they still don't want to give up the arms. There is no more Alawites in power in Syria, so there is no more Shiism in sense and like influential one in Syria. The Houthis on the other side, they're trying to fight, but still they're kind of confusing the Houthis, but they still control a large part of Yemen in the north with Sana'a being. But I also don't want to ignore Pakistan and Afghanistan. I don't have that much of knowledge on Pakistan and Afghanistan, except that there is the Hazara and also the Deobandis movement and so on. But I feel like now we should have a little discussion on it and see how this idea of this Shia Crescent is being kind of weakened today. And so that's pretty much why I was like, with whom I can have a discussion with, and that's pretty much where I find your information.
Thank you. No, wonderful. I'm
so
ready.
Maybe I can.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So maybe you can introduce yourself for everyone. Maybe not everyone know who you are, and as they don't specifically not that interested into Shiism or in the Middle East per se. So the floor is yours to explain that.
Thank you very much. So I am Vali Nasr. I'm a Majid Khadduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. I focus on the Middle East. I have focused on Iran, on its relations in the region, and also on the dynamics of sectarianism in geopolitics of the Middle East. So I wrote a book on Shia, rise of the Shia after the US invasion of Iraq. And more recently, I've worked on Iran's geopolitical maneuvering and its weakening, its grand strategy, if you would, of what it's after in the region. So I'm very pleased to join this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. So maybe we can start the discussion by opening it with a tiny bit of your book, The Shia Revival. So in it, you have argued that the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 accelerated a Shia awakening across the Middle East. Almost 2 decades later, how would you assess the trajectory of Shia's empowerment in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Pakistan, and Afghanistan?
So the American invasion of Iraq did two things. First of all, it opened the door to a social, cultural expression of Shiism in the Arab world. In other words, the populations had been there in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, across the Gulf region, in Syria, but in a way they were hidden. They not only were out of power, but even the political expression wasn't there, and there was no connection between these people. The opening of Iraq changed that. For instance, it's at the social, political dimension, it made it very clear in the Arab world that there were Sunni Arabs and there were Shia Arabs. And this was not just a matter of politics where we focused, but it's also cultural. For instance, millions of Shias from across the Arab world, but also from Pakistan, Afghanistan, began going to Najaf and Karbala or participate in the commemoration of Arba'in on an annual basis. In fact, Arba'in now has become a major cultural, religious event, whereas under Saddam, it was banned for decades. The city of Najaf and its religious leadership under Ayatollah Sistani, but the whole Marja'iyya in Iraq became much more visibly connected to Lebanon, Syria, Kuwait, Pakistan, Iran. And so you basically, below the radar of our politics, there was also a cultural awakening that there is a Shia world here, right? That has not gone away in a way, unless borders close in the Middle East and things like that happen, it doesn't go away. So we talk about, for instance, the weakening of Hezbollah, but that doesn't change the fact that the plurality, or it's the largest population in Lebanon, or the Shia. And that Shia population, much like the Shia population in Iraq, the Shia population in across the Gulf since 2003 has a different kind of cultural religious consciousness about who they are, right? And that's important. In other words, that's a kind of political metric that is not easy to measure or even to gauge what its impact might be in the long term. The second important dimension, which we focused on much more, was the political dimension of this. In other words, Iraq became de facto the first Shia Arab state, not because of its population. It always was a majority Shia country, but the Shias took over power. And actually, and then there was a negative reaction to this from Sunni powers in the region. So King Abdullah of Jordan called this a Shia Crescent, but not in a neutral term, as a warning, in a negative term. For Saudi Arabia, took about a decade before it actually had an ambassador in Baghdad, or that Sunni radicals affiliated with Salafism, with Al-Qaeda, later on with ISIS, they all viewed this empowerment of the Shia as being something absolutely negative. And in fact, ISIS was highly sectarian. And behind this was a fear of what a Shia awakening and a Shia assumption of power might mean for Iran. So I would put it in simple terms. Politically, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Salafis, Egypt, everybody looked and said, under Saddam, Iraq was in the Sunni camp, even though population was Shia. Now it's in Iran's camp. And in fact, their own behavior or reaction towards Iraq reinforced this. You know, there was a period of time that the only country that Iraq could count as a friend was Iran, because the rest of the Arab world were hostile to it. They didn't treat it as an equal member of the Arab world, the way they received its leaders, the way they reacted to it. So this was if you would, it was a geopolitical shift that what the United States achieved in Iraq was not democracy, those sort of lofty ideas they had, but was rather creating a Shia axis in the region that connected Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran together. It empowered Iran. And even though, and Syria, you're right, was under a secular Alawite regime, which was not self-consciously Shia, but it was an ally of Iran. And, that's the way also Hamas works in here. Now, this obviously benefited Iran, and it benefited Iran in a way that Iran came to be seen as a rising, threatening power by the Arabs. And this particularly manifested itself in Syria after 2014. In other words, you had a moment where many thought that the fall of Assad was not just about democracy, but the fall of Assad would empower the Sunnis, would be a defeat for Iran. And that's why a lot of Sunni powers in the region supported the uprising against Assad, but it failed. And in fact, the very reason Iran got involved in Syria was to defend this crescent, right? And to make sure that what it had gained with the transition of power in Iraq would not become undone. And in fact, the Iranians in 2014, that's why they got involved in Syria, was that they assumed that the challenge to Assad was all about them. This was not about helping the people of Syria or changing a brutal regime. This was all about defeating Iran, weakening Hezbollah, breaking the so-called crescent. And so they reacted accordingly. And they won at that point. If you look between 2014 to 2023, in a way, what came out of 2003 was consolidated. Now, since then, three important things have happened, which is important to note. One is that, particularly with the advent of of October 7th and the Gaza war and Israel's war on Hamas and Gaza, that the notion of Shia Crescent under Iran and Hezbollah was transformed into axis of resistance. And it didn't become about sectarianism, it became about resistance, or as the Arabs call it, the mughawama, right? And the very fact that Hamas and the Palestinians are not Shia, they're Sunni, essentially transformed this into mughawama. And you can see it in the language of Israel, the way they talk about this. In the language of Iran and Hezbollah itself, if you listen to speeches of Khamenei or speeches of Hassan Nasrallah, there's very little reference to Islam at all during the war. No mention of jihad, no mention of Shiism, no mention of any of these things. It's all about mughawama. It's sort of a more of an anti-imperialist construct. So in a way, this Shia Crescent basically became the representative of mughawama. And I suspect that it has got now much more popularity in the Sunni Arab world. And is in a way, it is that the war in Syria to defend Bashar Assad created a lot of bitterness among Sunnis towards the Shia, right? But that now has changed. So this is not something we see at the political level, but at the social level, I think that Shia Crescent is now not viewed as a threat. It's viewed as representing what is the sentiment of the Arab world on the ground, which is to resist on behalf of the Palestinians. So this is an important development, and the implications of this is not yet completely evident. The second important development was actually a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the geopolitical dimension I mentioned with 2003 and the collapse of Saddam basically converged the empowerment of the Shia, the resistance of the Sunnis, with a great power rivalry in the region, right, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And both sides saw, whether they wanted or not, behaved in a sectarian way, sometimes deliberately, sometimes the Iranians did not come and say, we're talking about Shiism, but everybody saw this as a Shia power play, whether Iran liked it or not. And the Saudis also tried to rally the Sunni world against what they saw as a Shia power play. So it was the Saudis who began to refer to Houthis as Shia, as Iranian-backed Shias, trying to make it clear to the Muslim world, to the Sunni world, that this is not about Yemen versus Saudi Arabia or anything else. It's sectarianism. And if you're a Sunni, your alliances should be with the Saudis, not with the Shia, right? And then, in the language of ISIS in particular and the Salafis, anti-Shiism is very, very clear, right? So when ISIS took over Syria, it was very, very anti-Shia. In Iraq, it beheaded Shias. That's actually what led to the rise of Hashd al-Shabi, the PMF forces. So in a way, there was a rise of sectarianism, which was also tied to Iran-Saudi rivalry in the region. And somewhere around 2022, after Iran attacks Saudi oil facilities, etc., that Saudis, following Emirates' lead, begin to decide that an open conflict in Iran is not to their advantage. It's not to the advantage of Vision 2030. They cannot count on the United States necessarily to do the fighting with Iran. And it's better to de-escalate with Iran. And the Iranians also, I think, had decided that they didn't want an ongoing conflict with Saudi Arabia. Both sides met in Iraq for 3 or 4 rounds of talks, and eventually, with the mediation of China, normalized relations. This normalization of relations basically meant that Saudi Arabia and Iran wanted at least a cold peace, and at best wanted some kind of a coexistence. They're not lovers, they're not, brother, but they wanted détente, and they want a de-escalation of tensions. Now, this greatly benefited sectarian because it meant that neither side would follow sectarian policies, and neither side would also let's say the population and the region, etc., now no longer saw that polarized situation. Now, for the Iranians, the benefit of this was that they understood that when they were winning in Syria and everybody was afraid of this Shia Crescent, there was now an increasing language. Initially, it was actually called an Israeli Sunni Arab alliance. In fact, in the West and in the United States where I live, it became common to refer to Sunni Arabs, which was not a term that you used in 1990s or 2000s, which basically meant that the West also saw this as a polarization along sectarian lines between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then, in a typical great power alliance, that Israel's alliance interest was the same as the Sunni Arabs against this Shia construct. And then when we arrive to today, this is still a debate. Washington is still trying to normalize, quote unquote, between Sunni Arabs and Israel, although they don't use the same language. And the other side is not called Shias, it's called axis of resistance. But in effect, it's the same thing. Now, the normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia made this picture less sharp. So Saudi Arabia now, it is not that we need to have an alliance with Israel against Shia Iran, is that we need to have both. So we're not following a sectarian policy with Iran, and Iran is not following a sectarian policy. It is a kind of a Shia-Sunni détente and a Shia-Sunni de-escalation. But at the same time, they wanted at least to build relations with the other side. So this is important. In other words, that de-escalation between Iran and Saudi Arabia has reduced tensions, particularly in Yemen. In other words, Yemen and Houthis and Saudis arrived at a ceasefire, if you would, which has opened the door to political settlement, and particularly was very helpful to Iraq. In fact, that's why the Iraqis wanted Iran and Saudi Arabia to get along and brought them to Baghdad to start the talking, right? The third important dynamic is obviously everything has happened since October 7th. And for the reason that it is drastically changing Middle East's geopolitics, right? So the war in Gaza, if we go past the regular sort of analysis that we have, that it has to do with awful things that Hamas did after October 7th, Israel's security, etc. But in reality, the flow of the war has had a number of implications. One is that for Sunni Arab states, it has created a dilemma for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, that the old view that Iran and the Shias were the threat is no longer as valid. In fact, the more Iran has been weakened, the more they have to worry about Israel. So if you ask King Abdullah today, what's his biggest worry, and I'm just guessing here, it's not the Shia Crescent. It is what will happen to the West Bank, what will happen to Gaza, what will happen to a sort of a completely new dynamic in what is the Arab-Israeli conflict compared to 2 decades ago. We're saying for Egypt. And that's why these countries are having much more diplomatic interaction with Iran. Like the Iranian foreign minister went to Amman, met even with the king, went to Egypt, met with Sisi. So, it's a very, in other words, the notion, the war has changed how important the sectarian rivalry in the region was. In other words, for both the Shias and the Sunnis, for both Iran and Saudi Arabia and other Arab states, it is not the other side that is the main problem, and Israel basically being a balancer on the outside. It's Israel that's the problem. But in different kind of a challenge for Saudi Arabia than it's for Iran or for Egypt. But it is still, this war is the war, the fate of the Palestinians, what's going to happen to Gaza, what's going to happen to the West Bank is a much bigger concern for Sunni Arabs than Iran is right now, especially because it has been weakened, right? So that's a very important issue. Maybe in the first phase of the war, the fact that the axis of resistance had the upper hand in the first year of the war was a worry. But now the axis of resistance has been diminished. So it's not like the Saudis or Egyptians are staying up at night thinking about axis of resistance, right? That's not the concern. So that's an important change in the dynamic. As we have to say, it's in the West, it's still everything is about Iran. Like, is Iran is up, is Iran is down? Yes, Iran was up, Iran is down, but there is other sets of issues that matter to this dynamic. And the Gaza war has changed this. Then the Gaza war in its second year onwards also weakened Hezbollah enormously as a force, and then weakened Iran as a force, right? And that plays into this. In other words, it actually ironically opens the door for greater collaboration between Shias and Sunnis. It could open the door to greater, my view, and I've written on this, that Saudis actually need Iran not to collapse, right? They need Iran, they need the weakened Iran the way it is, because they also have worries about Israel becoming a total victor, right? This is a sort of a black box, what does it mean, right? And so, and in the least, Iran is not a big concern. And that's why the Gulf countries had a very different tune. We're singing a very different tune when President Trump visited them recently. They didn't want war with Iran. It's Emirates that took a letter to Tehran asking Iran to join nuclear talks, which is a very different position than they took in 2015 after the first nuclear deal. So this is a very important dynamic. I mean, this is still a Shia country. It still has a role in Iraq. It still backs Hezbollah. It still is involved with Yemen. And the attitude of the Gulf has changed completely. And obviously, that means that there is no sectarian fight between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And in fact, the most important issue in the Middle East, as you and I are talking, is not sectarian issue. It's the Palestinian-Israeli and then Israeli-Iranian confrontation. But in other words, it's everything that's happening in the Levant, right? As opposed to Iraq, etc. And I would say the third one, which is pretty important, is the fall of Assad and the ascendance of HTS and Ahmad al-Sharaa. For the reason that even though he's taken his trimmed his beard and is wearing a suit and has transformed, which is quite important. I don't want to belittle it. But in the eyes of many Shias and in Iran's eyes, well, obviously is that he represents radical Sunnism, right? His heritage was Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Salafis, right? It's not that just that Iran supported Assad and he was fighting Assad, so they were enemies. But it's also, even though that he's moderated, what Ahmad al-Sharaa represents is the rise of Sunnis in Syria. Even if you say that it's not the hardline Sunnis, radical Sunnis, Salafi Sunnis, it's not moderated. Not everybody around him is moderate. A lot of his militias are still, could be seen as, yes, moderate in terms of Arab politics, but not moderate in terms of sectarian politics, right? So nowadays, when people ask, why doesn't Hezbollah give up its arms? Yes, it's because of Israel, but it's also because they're afraid of Ahmad al-Sharaa, especially as Israelis are meeting with him and talking to him, etc. So the rise of Ahmad al-Sharaa brings to the fore everything that the Shias feared in 2014 if Assad had fallen. The break of the crescent, and then you have to say, even if Ahmad al-Sharaa is totally moderate, what does the rise of the Sunnis mean, right, in Syria? So so the Iraqis worry that then, Iraqi Sunnis are going to say, well, now we have a Sunni in Damascus, then maybe we should renegotiate terms of power in Baghdad, or that the Sunnis in Lebanon may play differently. Although Ahmad al-Sharaa is not in total control of Syria. I mean, but you see, the reason that the Druze and the Alawites are afraid of him, and the Druze want even Israel's protection, is the same reason that the Shias in Lebanon, Iraq, or Iran are also afraid of him. If you looked at, it's not that the Druze just are finding an opportunity to break away, because the Druze believe that the kind of Sunnis that have come to power with Ahmad al-Sharaa view the Druze as heretics, right? The Alawites know it's not just because they were Assad's people, but that the Salafis view Alawites as heretics, right? So that's why they actually are, and in fact, the killings in Latakia, etc., that happened, these are really sectarian killings. They may be put under the context of revenge, but end of the day, just like it was the case in Iraq after Saddam fell, revenge against the community ends up being sectarian. There's no distinction. So the rise of Ahmad al-Sharaa, even though he's showing himself to be moderate, has opened a sectarian wound in the Levant, right, which could spread to the Gulf as well. Yes, Sharaa is being supported by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, maybe UAE. In other words, these are all the Sunni powers, but it's more complicated than 2003. These Sunni powers are also now have relations with Iran. They don't want trouble in the region, but they're also supporting the ascendance of Sunnism in Syria. This is an interesting dynamic, because we really don't know where the dust will settle in Syria, how powerful Sharaa will become, how viable will be the government in Damascus, because you have to also understand that it's extremely weak, because Turkey is basically in control of everything from Aleppo to Turkish border. Israel has expanded its foothold in Syria, is not tolerating a Syrian military at all, doesn't want Syria to have any real military, is defending the minorities in Syria. They first with Druze, but I think they will eventually maybe support the Alawites or support the Kurds as well. So it's not given, how strong would, that little bit of Sunni Arab control under Ahmad al-Sharaa become. But his rise is a sectarian phenomenon, even though it's not being characterized as such in the West, but it is a sectarian phenomenon. And so it has implications for Lebanon, right? It has implications for Iraq. And so we'll see how this will unfold. And ultimately, going forward, the most important question is what will happen to Iran? In other words, how strong will Iran remain, both as a country in terms of war with Israel, but then, to what extent and in what ways will it retain influence in Lebanon and in Iraq?
I completely agree your different point of view of how this Shia awakening is now more of a Shia resistance, like you've said. The dialogue have shifted, like we've seen before when in 1979, when there was the Islamic Revolution, the dialogue were more into having Islamic legitimation of what Shias are going to do, what the Sunni will also do. Like Saudi Arabia and Iran were polarizing Islam into justifying some of the
Mhm.
actions, fatwas, with the Velayat al-Faqih ideology and so on. We've seen how this competition has affected some of the neighboring country. We've seen in Lebanon with um, Hariri coming and going, and that was kind of
Mhm.
controlled by
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia. And then in Iraq after 2003, how the war were also into using this Shia wording to justify martyrdom and to protect, and having the
Mhm.
Shia having kind of a, we will answer back of what the Saddam Basis has done, the Sunni Saddam Basis has done to the Shia in the country. And today, I've seen that more and more. The dialogue is more into nationalism. We've seen in Saudi Arabia is more protecting their own nationalism. We've seen in the Emirates as well. We've seen how Qatar is being more and more a mediator with Oman as well. And now we've seen how Iran is trying to take more care of what is happening within the country and no more what is happening outside after what the repercussion of fighting with Israel and so on. And so the most important thing is now, since we've said that Saudi Arabia and Iran kind of are in a period of détente, we are also expecting to see a bit more of like cooler relations in countries that were supposedly controlled by Iran. For instance, you mentioned the Houthis in Yemen. The conflict with Saudi Arabia and the Houthis were mainly after historical with the borders of Yemen, how both of them were kind of fighting over the fact that Saudi Arabia, with a Taif agreement in 1934, took kind of the border that the Yemenites were trying to have, and then the Houthis to use that as a way to also fight against Saudi Arabia in 2015. So it was not only a religious aspect, but it was also an historical ones. And that's why it is important to mention that sectarianism is kind of losing a little bit of the forefront that they used to have after October 7th. But we kind of still see a little bit of the use of sectarianism to justify some actions, not as it
Mhm.
was before, but it's still there. For instance, in Iraq, I was there not so long ago, and I was able to study a little bit more. And when I came back after the Israeli attack on Iran, and then when Iran responded, um, uh, Muqtada al-Sadr used like we need to we condemn but will not fight with Iran into protecting this, and Iran find that as a betrayal in a sense, because they're supposed to be Shia and also protecting this Shia unity in a sense. So we still see some sectarian dialogue, but it is not as used as it was before. So
Yeah.
that's pretty much what I wanted to
No,
say.
no, I agree with you. Except I would say, I think, at some level, sectarianism at the political level was never about religion. It's about, the Saudi Houthi fight was always political. It's just that
Yes,
the Saudis found, for secular reasons, that it is beneficial to them if they characterize the Houthis as
yes,
Iranian-backed Shias, because
exactly.
that would get international support. That would clarify it for
Yeah. It was a way
for
also for Mohammed bin Salman to say, I'm here, I'm going to be the leader of the Muslim world. I'm there,
exactly.
I'm not going to fail you, Sunni. And that's also why they say Zaydism is Shia, so they are protected by Iran. And then Iran kind of accepted the Houthis as a Shia branch. And so they were like, okay, we will help you out into fighting
No,
against the
but they didn't.
Taliban.
But in a way,
Exactly.
it is the religious relations between Iran and the Houthis is very, very weak.
Yes.
Uh, um, so we have to sort of think of, when we talk about how Iran and Saudi Arabia weaponize sectarianism, is that they saw it as a tool of power against one another. But at the lower level, in these societies, it's a question of identity, right? It's who you are. In other words, let's say even in Lebanon, even if you're a secular Shia, born in Beirut, you go to nightclubs, etc., you still a Shia, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like Judaism in Europe. You don't have to be a religious Jew. I mean, historically, even if you're completely secular, it is the Gentiles who decide who the Jew is. So, I remember when I used to do research on Iraq, they would tell me, oh, you're putting too much emphasis on this. This was never an issue. We're all Iraqis. Okay. And then when you get into the conversation, they would say, well, I was a businessman under Saddam. I couldn't get loans. A Shia was only accepted if he was a self-denying Shia. If he would
Yes.
act Sunni, if he would never go to Najaf, if he would hide. So there is a level in this region, particularly in the Arab world and parts of the Arab world that are very diverse, where you have a layer that everybody's Arab. Everybody speaks Arabic. Everybody sees themselves as Arab. But when you dig a little one level below, you're something else, and sometimes it matters more. So Maronites are Arabs, and the Sunnis in Lebanon are Arabs, if you put the Shias aside, and Alawites are Arabs, and the Druze are Arabs. But that Arabism very quickly, it doesn't matter, right? It only matters against the rest of the world. But in reality, it very quickly becomes in who gets what in a country. I mean, ultimately, politics is about who gets what. They're not counted as equal citizens for varieties of reasons, and maybe they themselves have too much communal sense. And whether they go to mosque or whether they practice or not, that is a marker. And I think until the day where these diverse parts of the Arab world, I mean, this is not an issue in Saudi Arabia and in fact, Mohammed bin Salman has gone out of his way to integrate the Shias of Saudi Arabia more. But the other kings couldn't do it because under them, Saudi Arabia was so Wahhabi.
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yes.
And I have to, so now until the day where identity doesn't matter, like you become like Germans, like doesn't matter whether you're from Bavaria and you're Catholic or you're from western part of Germany and Protestant, that this will always be a political issue. The other thing I would add is that even before the Iranian Revolution, going back to 1960s onwards, where Islamism gradually became a very powerful political issue in the Muslim world. And Islam itself and practice of religion began to gain following in the Arab world and Muslim world as a whole, all the way from Indonesia to Senegal. End of the day, the more Muslim you become, the more Islamic you become, the more you rely on essentially what is the proper practice. And Islamism, even at its core, whether Sayyid Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, Maulana Maududi, all the way to bin Laden, al-Baghdadi, etc., basically define who's a good Muslim, who's a bad Muslim, who's not a Muslim. And the assumption increasingly, starting with Sayyid Qutb, this idea of takfir, was that there is a definition, narrow definition of who's a Muslim, and everybody else is not a Muslim. Yes. Including Sunnis. I haven't even got to Shias and Alawites and Druze. Even Sunnis. So when Sayyid Qutb basically said it is okay to wage jihad on Egyptian society, you said there's a small community of brotherhood. Everybody else is legitimate target of jihad, right? So in an environment from 1960s to at least today, where Islamism became important, Islamism does not claim to be sectarian, but it is. Because the way Islamism sees the Muslim world is very different from 19th century, Muslim society, which was much more tolerant and accepting of who's even within Sunnism, who's a Sunni, who's not. But under Islamism, under these decades of Islamism, automatically would be sectarian. Right.
That's also something that we can apply to Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've seen that today, for instance, I do know a bit more about Taliban in Afghanistan than what is happening in Pakistan. But what we've seen is like the Taliban since, well, I will just talk about 2021, not go back too much in history, but they applied a lot of fatwas and a lot of like decrees saying that a proper Muslim has to do this, has to do that, and that's why they also persecuted the Hazara because they're Shiites mainly, and the Taliban followed the Sunni branches of Islam, and then in a different ideology as well. So it's they adopted fatwas to also kind of discriminate and persecuted women, say women have to do this because it is what Islam has said about women.
No,
And
you're
that's
very right. I mean, if you went to Pakistan and India and you went a generation before this, yeah, people knew who's a Shia, who's a Sunni. In fact, Pakistan is a very interesting country because it is the second largest Shia country in the world, based on just percentage. 25% are Shia, but that is in a country of 120 million. That's larger than almost all the Shias in the Arab world. That yes, Shias were Shias, Sunnis were Sunnis. Sunnis would go for Ashura visit. Shias, yes, periodically they may be a tiff, etc. But as over time in the 70s, 80s, 90s, Pakistan became more and more Islamist. It's the definite. You had more and more hardline Sunni groups arose. It became more sectarian because Islamism claims to be Islamism. It's not doesn't call itself Sunnism, or we don't call it Sunnism. It's Islamism, but its definition is that there is only one definition of Islam, which is based on a very narrow interpretation of Sunnism. And Shias would fall immediately to be completely heretics. And so sectarianism was encouraged, not consciously, but subconsciously as Islamism swept across the Muslim world. So, you have cases like in Malaysia that the government actually made being a Shia a criminal offense. Or although there are no Shias over there, in a way, but this had to do with this sort of the kind of changes that we saw in the Muslim world from the 60s and 70s, which, yes, the Iranian revolution encouraged because it was the first revolution that was carried out by Muslims. But as much as Khomeini tried to speak for Islam as a whole, within the Sunni world, he was not accepted. He might have accepted as a model that we should follow some of his tactics, etc., but he wasn't accepted as a leader. Why? Because because he was a Shia. I mean, if you're a good Islamist Muslim Brotherhood member, you could not accept Shias as legitimate Muslims, and you could not accept Khomeini as a legitimate Islamic leader. Right now, we're entering a period also that Islamism's own attraction is declining. Even Hamas doesn't use Islamist language and in fact, it's very telling that since October 7th, it is all about muqawama and resistance.
Yeah,
it is not
they use
about
history
Islam.
in it to justify.
Yeah, I mean, they don't use words like this is a jihad.
Exactly, yes.
Like this is an Islamic jihad, etc. This is sort of a nationalistic resistance. So that actually does also change the context for Shias and Sunnis, right? Because it's not Islamic law that is driving now sectarianism, and so that's also an important development.
So going back to our discussion, I will ask you another question, but it's related to what you've said about how Ayatollah Khomeini was trying to be like the leader of the Muslim world by being a sort of a pope. It is written in your book, The Shia Revival, that there was the institution of the papacy, the Marja'iyya, centralized source of legitimacy and authority in Shiism. So we've seen that it is quietly linked to the idea of Vilayat al-Faqih, where there is this idea of having a papacy in a sense. Looking at today's fragmented religious and political landscape, does this analogy still hold? Is it still applicable into today's situation?
Well, today's situation, the context is pretty different. I mean, you mentioned even Iran itself, since the Israel attack, has adopted much more of a nationalist language. And Iran's supreme leader does not position himself like Khomeini did as a leader of the Islamic world. So we're in a very different context in the region. But the period in which sectarianism dominated in the region, which is from, let's say, 70s till the 2000, mid 2010s, etc., is an important part of the history of the region. So it cannot be erased completely. It is the basis on which the next phase will be built in a new context. And ultimately, the actors themselves are changing. So Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman is disavowing Wahhabism, right? So if Wahhabism is declining in Saudi Arabia, it gives him room to reach out to Shias of Saudi Arabia. It allows him to reach much more openly to Shias of Iraq, for instance, Shias of Kuwait, etc., right? In Iran itself, Islamism has declined. Yes, you have an Islamic Republic, but that's just what it's called. Its language is increasingly national security and nationalism, right? Its relationship with Hezbollah, Iraq, etc. It's largely strategic thinking of how do you confront Israel using these groups, rather than Ayatollah saying we need to defend or build religious reasons. So even if they use Shiism, it's for strategic purposes to serve Iran's interest, right? And so you have a more sort of secular politics there. But at a level also, the Shia-Sunni difference in the region was never an artificial construct. There are actual people. There is an actual contestation of power, right? In other words, the Sunnis in Iraq used to rule. Now the Shias rule. They're getting used to it. But even the division of power, according to Iraqi constitution, emphasizes sectarianism. So you cannot have a Sunni prime minister.
Yeah,
it's very much like Lebanon, right? So in a way, it's enshrined even in the constitutional setup of these countries. So what will happen to Lebanon as we're speaking? It's not just about Iran. It's also about what kind of a political settlement comes out of the current situation in Lebanon. What kind of political settlement comes out of Syria? What kind of political settlement comes out of Iraq? So this is still an unfolding picture. So no, we're not in the 2000s, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not relevant either to what comes next.
Yeah, like for what comes next, we've seen that not so long ago, the Iraqi parliament kind of institutionalized Hashd al-Shaabi as possibly be part of the army, and it's raised kind of a lot of bad connotation for the US, saying that, oh, it's the rise of Iran again, we are opposed to it, we don't want that. So mainly the US and the West said Iran will be behind Hashd al-Shaabi as well. Hashd al-Shaabi is like one of the most important militia in Iraq. It has one of the biggest budgets in the country, and most of it also comes from Iran and the arms as well. So that's also why the West are kind of alarmed. But within the country, it is not because of Iran that they are alarmed. It's because, in a sense, the states will or will not have the power to control Hashd al-Shaabi. How are they going to control this militia? Are they going to be controlled by the militia or not? And also, so is it going to give much more credit and power to the Shias in Iraq, and not how Iran is going to control a middle?
Yeah. No, I think what you outlined is a very Western way of looking at this.
Exactly. Yes.
In both Lebanon and in Iraq. So yes, Hashd al-Shaabi and Hezbollah have been Iran's instruments, but at some level, the community also sees the Shias in Lebanon and Iraq using Iran for their own interests.
Exactly, yes.
So this is particularly clear with HTS. HTS was created by fatwa by Ayatollah Sistani, who is not a overtly sectarian person, after the rise of ISIS and the beheadings of Shia soldiers and the threat that ISIS posed to Baghdad, Najaf, and Karbala, right? The Iraqi army was useless. It was not going to protect, even though the country was ruled by Shias, the Iraqi army was not capable of protecting Shias. So they created HTS. Now HTS has become a problem because it's kind of like, you create a Frankenstein you can't control. It's corrupt, it's brutal. It needs to be brought into alignment. Many Iraqis, including Shia Iraqis, people in government, they don't like HTS, etc. But why is it that Ayatollah Sistani will not issue a fatwa to dismantle HTS? So forget about the parliament, etc. And the answer is very simple. It's sectarian, because HTS, with General Soleimani's help, after it defeated ISIS, also took control of all of the Sunni areas of Iraq.
Yeah, like
right.
Jur for the Sakr.
Exactly. So it's not about what they're doing in Baghdad and Basra in the south. So what Ayatollah Sistani is really afraid of, particularly since Ahmad al-Sharaa has come to power in Damascus, so that if you remove HTS from these Sunni areas, ISIS will be back.
Yeah.
Yep. And the same logic is also playing in Lebanon. Forget about Iran. Forget about its meddling. Forget about its agenda. What's going to happen to the Shias of Lebanon? Okay. So because our discourse is about how anti-Israeli, how anti-American, how anti-European Hezbollah is, what a terrorist organization it is. But at the same time, this argument that Hezbollah was defending South Lebanon from Israel to Shias of Lebanon is real. You know, Israel is not a threat to Maronite lands. It's not a threat to Tyre and, the Sunni areas of Lebanon. Israel is right now occupying Shia areas in the south, is not allowing going back. Israel's record in the Arab world is that when it takes land, it doesn't voluntarily give it up, right?
I completely agree, yes.
So, and then let's say if Hezbollah disarms, right? It sounds really good, there should be a Lebanese army. But, in the Arab world, the argument is, okay, there was an Iraqi army. It was useless, right? I mean, if you're an Iraqi Shia, you would hate HTS, but you may trust it more to protect you. Not in terms of shaking you up for corruption and bullying you and taking your business, but if there is ever a repeat of ISIS, who's going to fight, right? And the same is now applies to Lebanon. So is the Lebanese army really going to defend against Israel? A Lebanese army controlled by United States and France and armed by them, is it really going to stand up to Israel? Or is it going to even forget about Israel? Is it going to really stand up to Ahmad al-Sharaa and HTS if they decide to show up in Baalbek and Nabatea, right? So what's going to happen? So this is actually real, and so that's where I meant that the rise of Ahmad al-Sharaa and where HTS will go, how much power will it have, what will it do to the balance of power, will have an impact on the debate about the future of Hezbollah and the future of HTS. I mean, one of the things that the Europeans and Americans are blind to is that they have to find a way to guarantee real security. Like these Lebanese army or Iraqi army have to be really able to provide security in the sectarian sense, right? Not just be the argument that, okay, every country has a national army and the national army should be in charge. But Iraq had that. In 2014, it proved useless.
Yeah, so that's also an opinion that I join. That's something where I've seen a lot of scholars blaming every time Iran when we talk about militias, when when you kind of read the history and the reason of why they were created, there is a reason more nationalistic in it, and a mission to protect their own community that was failed by the main government that was supposed to protect them in a sense. And so having a discourse that is completely anti-Iran is kind of denying the existence and the real reason of why militias were kind of created in a sense. They were created to
Right.
protect the people. And we've seen in 2006 when there was the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And when we've seen also how ISIS was taking control of all over the country.
And especially if you, and sorry to cut you off, but
Yeah.
especially because ISIS is now, in their eyes, ISIS is now back in power in Syria.
Exactly.
Right? In
Yes.
other words, okay, he's wearing a tie and he's trimmed his beard. And yes, this image of Ahmad al-Sharaa is now much more credible to
Yeah.
Sunni Arab states and to the Westerners than it is to Shias in the region.
Exactly. And that's where it is kind of a scenario. I was able to see that by talking with Iraqis when I was there. And some of them were like, we don't really know what to think about Ahmed al-Sharaa, because it kind of brings back the idea of where ISIS came into power in Iraq in 2006, and everyone ignored them. The Shiites were the one being targeted because they were considered as kuffar mainly. And then the militias happens, the pops up. And that's where they were like, okay, we need to protect our own community because we are targeted as kuffar.
Yeah,
And so we're the
exactly.
reason why we're being hated and killed. And that's why seeing Ahmed al-Sharaa brought back this kind of dialect from the Iraqis that I've met.
No,
And
absolutely. No,
yeah.
It's been a fascinating conversation. I very much enjoyed it. It's excellent. No, I agree with you. I think that's absolutely right.
And I'll ask you two last questions, I swear,
Sure,
because I
sure.
had more questions, but I feel like it was better to
Yeah.
have this type of on and on.
No, it's wonderful. Yeah.
So let me choose one properly.
Yeah, I have about maybe 5 more. 10 more
Okay, one
minutes to
last
go.
question
Yeah,
then.
sure.
So it's more about your work. Can you tell me more about, you've been able to critique the US disengagement from the Middle East. And today we're seeing them that they're not as disengaged as they're trying to show us. We've seen how they support Israel most of the time and what is happening in the region. Do you think that this engagement will have some lasting influence in the country that we're seen badly as a Shiite country controlled by Iran?
Well, I'm not sold on the idea that U.S. is engaging. I mean, disengagement never meant that there are going to be zero Americans in the region, et cetera. I think the way it's seen was that the U.S. doesn't want to go to another war in the region. And what the Saudis discovered in 2022 when Iran attacked its oil facilities is that the United States is not willing to defend it, right? It's willing to give it weapons to defend itself. And that's actually why Saudi's strategic position vis-a-vis Iran started to change, right? And even now with Gaza, the lesson that the region may be drawing, and I don't want to say everybody in the region thinks the same, is that yes, United States is willing to support Israel, but that doesn't mean that it was willing to go to war for Arabs, right? And even in the war with Israel, the United States was willing to drop a few bombs on Fordo, but immediately call a ceasefire, right? So the US, the larger issue of disengagement, maybe the way I would put it, which is more strategically relevant, particularly for smaller countries that have relied on the US, is that the United States is not willing to fight for them. There was a time when the United States saw issues in the Middle East as vital to it. So I would give it an example that when Saddam invaded Kuwait, the Saudis didn't think they need to go to war. The Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, went to Saudi Arabia and persuaded King Fahd why he had to invite American troops and agree to push Saddam out of Kuwait back into Iraq itself, right? That moment has passed. So the United States does not right now see any issue worth going to war in the Middle East. And in fact, even President Trump may be forced into a war if Iranians start killing Americans and something big happens. But in reality, even Israel realized that the United States is not willing to go to war for it. right? Yes, dropping a few bombs, but immediately calling a ceasefire. It's almost looked like Trump wanted to remove Iran's nuclear program as a reason to go to war, which is the same reason why President Obama signed the nuclear deal. You know, we don't want to go to war. Let's take the nuclear issue off the table. One of them did it through a deal. Trump couldn't get to a deal. He said, okay, I just destroyed the program, obliterated, and he kept emphasizing that there's no more program. I've obliterated because he just doesn't want to go to war. So the lesson the Middle East has learned is that yes, the U.S. says we're here, we're engaged, etc., but it's not willing to fight for them, right? And it doesn't see any reason vital to the United States to fight in the region, right? Especially now that Iran has been weakened. In fact, the U.S. engagement may get even less. U.S. wants to make money in the Middle East, and that's only in 3 countries. The rest of the Middle East is not relevant to this. It's only 2 small Emirates and Saudi Arabia. That's become the Middle East for the West.
Yeah.
There's the other 220, 30 million people from, Jordan to Morocco is just not part of the conversation. But even for those small countries, they saw that there's huge limits to what the U.S. is willing to do, and that obviously changes the picture, right? Because it's all about security. This is not a question of you like this, you like that. Countries have interests, and for Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, their security matters enormously. There was a time when they thought that America would go to war for them.
Yeah.
In fact, they didn't need to persuade America. They didn't need to ask. Americans were already, way ahead of them in wanting to pick fights with Iran, with Soviet Union, with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. Now it's not the case. And in fact, the understanding of President Trump is that, and even I think Israel has realized that there is a limit to how far the U.S. might want to go. So yes, the issue of Iran is not resolved, and it will test whether the United States wants to go in or not. But I think there is a wide margin now between what Iran might do and what might bring the United States into a war, right? And there's all kinds of pressures are going to be put on Iran, economic, all sorts of things. But I think the question now is U.S. has a lot of bases in the Middle East, has a lot of soldiers, but does it want to use them, or are they ornamental?
That's a good question to ask. And
so that's a good question to ask. And that's because the answer to that is not 100% clear. If you are Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, you begin to sort of have to hedge and have to guess and have to have plan Bs and plan Cs and plan Ds.
And that's why they created the different policies, Vision 2030, and different type of vision to see how.
And also making normalization with Iran, normalization, Abraham Accord with Israel. All of this, trying to build these alliances, removing all their irritations with Turkey, getting back with Turkey. The way they see it is that they cannot live in a world where they were so secure in the U.S. Support that they could say, we don't need Turkey, we don't need Israel, we don't need Iran. And now they realize that they have to have a much more sophisticated, strategic policy vis-a-vis the region, exactly because it's not clear what the U.S. commitment to the region is. Anyways, it was really good speaking with you.
Thank you very much.
It was
a pleasure as well.
Having further conversations. Thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
You as well. Take care. Bye-bye.